Dark Souls 2 reviews. There's many of them, at least 50, and they're still being made even to this day. Some good, mostly bad, while others are just trolls. So I'm here to rank a good amount of the most popular and talked about ones in this video to save you a lot of time that I lost for the sake of original entertainment. Starting out with a video defending Dark Souls 2 made by Kadai. He mostly talks about enemy placement in the game and how people are complaining about a non-issue since he never struggled with a lot of the enemies chasing his ass, except for like one time, and argues that you should be using your brain and actually figure out how the game wants you to deal with a lot of dudes jumping you. Whether it be using the million unique ways Dark Souls 2 allows you to interact with areas to make your life easier, or using range or spells or the 50 summons the game gives you to clear areas, or to simply come back when you're stronger instead of just bashing your head against the wall of enemies by either running away from them or trying to kill them one by one, which doesn't work very often, which leads to people believing that they're playing an artificially difficult game, which isn't true. He then complains about most bosses being far too easy, especially compared to the areas themselves leading up to them, which is definitely true, but hey, he did compliment the ones that were unique and fun/challenging to fight. But unfortunately, that's where the second half of the video comes in, and much like the second half of Dark Souls 1, it's significantly worse. He first talks about how some areas in Dark Souls 2 suck, much like in Dark Souls 1, and pitch black areas especially aren't fun to traverse at all, which is true, but then you start to ask yourself this while watching. Why doesn't this man just use a torch or a spell or something? And his response is,
in case you're wondering, I don't believe in torches. You can go into my man Tittle's save file here, and he didn't light a single goddamn torch in all of the gutter. Not even one. It's still unlit, and he likes it that way. And it's gonna stay that way.
Mate, I'm sorry, but if you have options to go through so you can make the game more fun and you're actively avoiding plus handicapping yourself from those options, then it's your fault for not enjoying them as much as you could have. But he is still right about them sucking overall. What he isn't right about is Sense Fortress and the gutter being bad areas. Somehow this castle-like dungeon filled with unique traps made to make the player suffer and pay attention to their surroundings whilst encouraging them to look for secrets since something good could be right around the corner during their fight against snakes with lightning is badly designed? It seems logical to me. Also, if you just use a torch like you're supposed to, the gutter becomes infinitely more fun and enjoyable since it's based around you using it. Oh, but the place is stinky and filled with hollows and abominations and you can fall directly to your death. My man, did you forget what kind of game you were playing? Also, with some well-timed jumps and the usage of torches which let you see where you're going, you won't have a problem with that. He also says that he heavily dislikes Dark Souls 2 for not feeling very interconnected like its predecessor, but that's more of a personal preference than valid criticism, since a lot of us love the quality of life like fast travel being available at the very start, but by far the dumbest take on this video is that Dark Souls 2 is apparently too long. I don't know about you, man, but I'm pretty sure people love it when Souls games are long. It's how you can 100% Elden Ring like 3 times and still want more Souls. Not to mention that most people want more Dark Souls 2. If that wasn't the case, why are there like 3 quality DLCs for this game? Plus he says that the game feels like a slog, but even if you beat most bosses first try, it never really feels that way, as the gameplay loops very similar to previous and future Souls games, and people like that because the arenas, concepts, enemy design, enemy design, areas, lore, music all culminate into a fun experience, and maybe he feels different about that since Dark Souls 2 is different from what he's used to and he's not really into it, as that's the only way I can imagine someone making a complaint as weird as it's too long. But overall, despite the video having a few misunderstandings and some stuff ultimately coming down to mere preference and him not really addressing other big complaints that people had for the game, it's a decent video, which is what I would have said had he not said this.
I did kill the optional ancient dragon, and that was a great boss fight, by the way.
D tier. Up next is Joe Gella's review. He starts out by talking about the good game mechanics that Dark Souls 2 brings in, like twin blades, life gems, a unique new game cycle, yada yada, and that's all nice and great. He highlights most of the great things this game added, in fact. Now moving on to the bad game mechanics, however, we of course have complaints about adaptability, vitality, hollowing, stamina, enemy persistence, you name it. It's safe to say that this man has a long list of complaints to make about this game, and the vast majority of them are either nitpicks that don't really affect the game much or hyperbolic takes on some of the game's bad aspects. Let me explain. ADP is a stat that allows you to dodge just fine if at level 25. That's it. Sure, it's a bad stat, but this is the same game that allows you to respec attack and refight bosses and get like a bajillion souls, so leveling up is never that big of a hassle. Same thing goes for vitality. Also, having your HP take a penalty the more you die fits with the lore of the game, and if you don't like that, use the Ring of Binding. That's very easy to get early. But Bradley, I lose out on a ring slot. No you don't, that ring serves a purpose and is helpful to newer players. If you get better at the game, you won't need it. Plus, you can quite literally get infinite effigies later in the game, and they're not that hard to come by, especially because there's a certain woman desperately trying to kill you often. Also, are you really gonna complain when you still have 3 slots? That's still more than what Dark Souls 1 gave you. And let's say this, there's a lot of enemies chasing you constantly. Simply either kill them or quit out, or find ways to juke/outrun them. You've done so in Dark Souls 1, I don't see a reason why you wouldn't now. Also, if you're wondering about stamina, literally just walk. If you're still unconvinced, we'll talk about walking around attacks later, but I'm not joking when I say this, you can easily walk around attacks. Most of them, in fact. But Bradley, I lose out on like 2% of my damage output by attacking with low stamina. So yeah, the rest of the video is him complaining about the quote-unquote bad level design, and honestly you guys, when I was watching the video I was like, alright, this ain't so bad. He's definitely over-exaggerating it and nitpicking, but let's be optimistic. Only for Joe fucking Gella to grab this game by the neck and throw it down his toilet and into his sewers where he traveled just to say, not enough, and then he threw it down the top of his pit below the sewers again into the gutter, and then the black gulch, and finally into the abyss, never to be seen again, only for him to go, oh, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think about Dark Souls 2 now that I've shown you that it's not a bad game. I mean, just look at this. The best way for me to point out how dumb these arguments are without making the video an hour long is to use this handy button right here. The fucking takes he made during the second half of his 40-minute nightmare of a video was so garbage that I'm deeming his take to be one of the worst I've ever seen. F tier. No, actually double F tier, because he compared Dark Souls 2 to games that came out after it, which isn't fair. Now onto a slightly better video made by the man himself, Zero Lenny, baby. And in this video he goes over some positives that you'd expect, complimenting the world and saying that some stuff doesn't exactly need to make sense for it to be cool. Since if you've forgotten, Drang Lake is a kingdom supposed to be in a dream-like state, where we even hear about Quella, who's the goddess of dreams, and thus it doesn't make sense by design. Something Elden Ring would shamelessly steal 8 years later, and I shamelessly stole this joke from a certain furry YouTuber. He also likes the amount of life gems you could have, but criticizes them for being far too easy to acquire, which is fair and valid. Now for the negatives, he points out a bunch of things that we've already talked about, so let's tackle some arguments we've yet to go through, and that's the game feeling slow, which he says makes the game feel lacking in combat, since we're all used to faster paced combat, which is generally more fun and is what's expected, though he does clarify that some people may like Dark Souls 2's so-called turn-based approach to fights, and that it's not necessarily worse game design, which is true and I appreciate him pointing that out, but some bad points are also made where he has a bit of a hot take and says that power stancing doesn't add some crazy new variety to weapons, since most of the time you don't get many movesets in comparison to how much equipment there is to choose from, and thus concluding that people exaggerate on how meaningful this feature is. But although I get where he's coming from, I do disagree quite a lot, since while yes, although the movesets aren't usually anything that unique, the fact that the developers even made it a thing should be commended, considering that they definitely would have expanded on this idea had they had more time instead of this rushing shit. Let's also not forget that sometimes all you need to be happy fighting is to swing 2 things at once, which satisfies most people, including me, even if it's not overly fancy or diverse, except oh wait, it is diverse. Just swap out your moves constantly, which allows you to do some really cool things like going from heavier damaging slow attacks to quick and nimble ones, or dodge while attacking simultaneously, which is possible on certain weapons. If you want even more out of power stancing, get a bone fist and pair it up with any fist weapon available, or hold the so-called majestic greatsword in your left hand because reference, and pair it up with another greatsword and boom, or use some other fun greatswords like these. Dark Souls 2 gives you the most unique equipment possible, so it's just a matter of mixing and matching things. I get so pissed imagining people talk about how cool Dark Souls 3 is for giving us the Lion's Claw attack using the greatsword of Artorias, when they forget that Dark Souls 2 came up with that concept first. The other thing I wanted to talk about is Lenny going, oh, Dark Souls 2 keeps reminding you of how hard it is instead of letting the gameplay do all the talking. When not only does... Okay, never mind, he beat me to it. But clearly he's forgotten about the Crestfallen, since in the trilogy these sad pieces of shit are always constantly reminding you that you'll perish miserably and that nothing's worth doing. So how come he only complains about it when a couple of red-hooded old ladies say it? The game's supposed to be cruel, both in its difficulty and design, although he is kinda right about the game being a little too easy. But guess what? So are the rest of them. Every Souls game is easy when you think about it. After all of them are RPG games where you decide where to go or what to get to smash somebody's face in, but they're still difficult when you're first going into them. So yeah, in summary, a couple red-hooded old ladies telling you that you'll die for the sake of immersion is nothing out of the ordinary for the Souls series. Now the rest of the complaints are minor nitpicks I'm not gonna go over, and if you wanna see someone dissect every point made, go watch this guy. More on him later. But you know what, despite that, this video is a solid A tier. Not just for the great editing and jokes that make the not too long video enjoyable despite the questionable arguments, but also because at the end he says the most important piece of advice you could ever get from watching any of these, which we'll get to later. Now that was one of the shorter ones, probably the shortest one here. In stark contrast, however, we have the single biggest behemoth of a video clocking in at 3 hours and 42 goddamn minutes. Holy fucking shit, how do you expect anyone to watch this? Most people don't have the time to watch a video this long for a simple yet ultimately subjective answer, and it's made even worse by the fact that this video, in the nicest way possible, just fucking sucks. If you were gonna make something this damn long, at least put in some jokes or unique editing rather than just gameplay over commentary, which basically means you'll just be listening to this in the background as opposed to just watching it plainly. But no matter, this man complains about the usual. For example, enemy persistence, but then he goes on to boldly claim that Dark Souls 2's level and enemy design are both step downs from its predecessors. Not only that, right, but he also mentions that the game's difficulty feels more bullshit than challenging, which isn't the case for its previous and future pals. So if you've noticed a little trend with his arguments, is that he just blatantly ignores everything that's wrong with the other Souls games and creates arguments that are mostly problems future and previous Souls games suffer from. What a shit show. Zanny was right all along, man. With all due respect, this man's voice is soothing, and he must be really passionate about Souls games to express his emotions and make a video this long. Plus he even compliments some of the good things Dark Souls 2 did, but to criticize something is to ideally display an equal amount of something's weak and strong points. And here it's just mostly negativity, as he views Dark Souls 2's style as worse, not different. So if you're really gonna sit here for this long only to tell me that this game is somehow vastly inferior to fucking Demon Souls, then you've definitely messed up somewhere. F tier. Moving on to Feeble King. Before I say what I'm about to say, I would just like to say that everyone's entitled to their opinion, and this man at least tried to understand what he was doing, and I respect that. But everyone considers this to be one of, if not the worst Dark Souls 2 / scholar review on the internet. And this is only one of the multiple videos he's made on this subject. But because I've never played Dark Souls 2 and have only gone through Scholar, this one feels appropriate. And before we get into this, I'd just like to point out that the title's literally called Another Hate-Filled Critique About Dark Souls 2, so you already know what sort of video this is. And this video is so godforsaken and awful that even fucking Oli Waifu told this man to shut his mouth, and I mean, you've gotta be doing something seriously wrong for that to happen. And the more you watch this dude, the more you agree with this comment. You already know the drill, so let's talk about the main quote-unquote criticisms of this video, which is enemy design and placement. Ranges are fun and boring, too many enemies, too stupid of a lock-on system, bad level design, bad boss design, bad level design part 2, characters too slow, B team didn't try hard enough, gameplay's too slow, gameplay's too bullshit and unfair, gameplay's too boring, game devs are stupid, game only cares about you dying, DLCs are stupid, you name it. The more I watched this cursed abomination called the video, the more I understood where his channel's name came from. It's very clear from the get-go that he just doesn't understand Souls games whatsoever, and by far the most reiterated point is, yo, I don't know what to do in order to clear this area, man. Do I kill all the enemies? Do I run past them? Do I shoot them? Do I play locked on or off? Do I leave a bad review? And you're just looking at it and just saying to yourself, it's not that deep, bro. If a horde of enemies keeps killing you, either kill them off one by one or run past them or use the limitless ways the game gives you to defeat all of them. And he just keeps ranting about this weird idea that you feel conflicted on whether or not to play locked on or off because he plays better whilst locked off. And I don't know about you, man, but there's this thing called preference. Some people find it better to be locked off like you, and most find it better to be locked on. And no matter what you think, thing, Dark Souls 2's lock-on system is essentially the same as every other Souls games. In fact, it's better than in Dark Souls 1, I would argue, considering that you can only roll in 4 separate directions in that game. So many of his goddamn arguments are just problems that can be solved with getting better at the game, but because he's so inclined on bashing his head against the wall, he doesn't have fun and doesn't do things like skipping the smelter demon for now and coming back later, for example, and just keeps blaming the game for his shortcomings and says that by placing traps that make the areas of the game more fun and unique and focused on making you pay attention to your surroundings as to not be caught off guard, Dark Souls 2 somehow being difficult just because it wants to, and boldly says that the devs just make dumb decisions. And the rest of course are nitpicks like backstabs not giving you iframes, which admittedly sucks but isn't a big deal since you'll just have to kill a bunch of enemies first before being able to execute one in every game. Plus the game didn't want you to cheese your way through its encounters by making backstabs difficult, so I still feel like this is a better change overall. But there's also one last thing apart from him talking about the quote-unquote negative DS2 aspects in the quote-unquote the good section of the video, and it's him ranking the DLCs. And let me tell you guys something about me. I have a philosophy that if something's so inherently dumb and insane that it bewilders you just from hearing and or seeing it, then you don't need to hear it out or waste any of your time paying attention to it. Because you already know whatever's gonna be told is stupid and completely nonsensical. So here I was, blazing through this at twice the speed, and then I reached this part.
This is the only S-tier Dark Souls 2 fight, and the most fun I've had with the game by a lot.
Okay, you know what? At least you know, he gives the Fume Knight the credit he deserves. You know what? Maybe this review is still salvageable.
After beating Fume Knight, I thought the B team at FromSoft learned from their past mistakes to make an amazing DLC.
Wait, what do you mean? What do you mean? I thought? What do you mean? I thought? What? Are you about to say that the other DLCs are bad?
No, they did not. Sir alone is terrible.
Unfucking believable. Actually unbelievable, bro. No, I'm out of here. Nah, fuck this. I frankly could not give less of a shit about anyone's opinion on this game if they say something as outrageous as that. Call me a purist or a Dark Souls 2 glazer, some arguments should not be listened to. I couldn't stomach anymore after this. You're going straight to the trash. Before we talk about the last review and close off this video for good with the main point, I'd just like to talk about a certain someone named Domo3000 whose channel I discovered while starting out with my research. This guy is the prime example of a Dark Souls 2 defender. He will protect it and scholar with his life and die on that hill. He's debunked so many Dark Souls 2 reviews that he's basically created a hobby of just doing that. He's even got entire playlists where he just dissects everything wrong with people's arguments and complaints about this game, and his content is funnily a version of what he's criticizing. Now I'm not gonna put these in the tier list or take a look at them since that's quite meta, and a lot of the time he just reiterates the same counter arguments over and over since DS2 reviews are a broken record. More on that later. And I personally really dislike AI voices, which he uses unfortunately, and also these videos only really keep feeding the fire of DS2 debates, and some of them even debunk videos that came out years ago, which feels quite pointless as the opinions of those probably either changed or no one really cared about them now or back then. The point being, this guy's a legend. And furthermore, he proves that Dark Souls 2's hitboxes are only slightly worse than DS3's, and that game came out years later, and that they're basically just as good as Dark Souls 1's hitboxes by actually showing you the geometry. And though I do disagree with some of what he says, I just find it funny how he's responded to basically every single relevant DS2 review, and I just want to share that with all of you. Alright, for the finale, we'll go over Chopper's classic Dark Souls 2 is worse than you remember review. Obviously, we're not off to a great start since I remember people hating on the game more back then, especially since they don't quite understand the attention to detail that was put into DS2, and video game communities usually being very averse to change, which is annoying when trying to introduce a Souls game that's inherently different from the usual, but whatever. Actually, not whatever, because even the intro doesn't feel right. First of all, he says that the game's objectively not as well done as its predecessors and future iterations, which I don't know about you, but even if one thing was better in Dark Souls 2 than in any other Souls game, then it's objectively subjective, which makes you objectively wrong. But it doesn't get any better with him saying it doesn't understand what makes a good successful Souls game, and I don't even need to tell you why that's wrong. But let's get into the actual meat here, and in this 1 hour long video, the only original points I could find and talk about here were just blatant lies, like hidden walls always needing Ferrous lockstones to interact with, even though those are the special Ferrous hidden walls, not real ones, or not having enough fragrant branches to unpetrify every statue you see, which is actually true, but only for the original Dark Souls 2. And Scholar didn't invent this feature, and I do admit that having them be directly tied to progression does suck, but also nobody else complained about this other than like 2 people in these videos, so it's not a big deal, considering that you can still get like 6 in total, and it teaches you to conserve them as a resource anyway. Plus, most of the time the game indicates when you should really unpetrify a statue, like an entire area being blocked off by Rosabeth, or showing you a bonfire blocked off by a statue of a particularly interesting looking man. Other than that, they only unlock shortcuts or cool items that aren't necessary to get, and if you want them, play through a new game cycle, which Dark Souls 2 does best. And lastly, he says that burning a windmill to get rid of the poison in Mrs. Arena is nonsensical and dumb, even though that windmill powers up the contraptions that spew poison everywhere, and with how close it is to the bonfire, you have an easy way of lighting up torches if you didn't already have a flame butterfly somehow. You can tell that they put thought and effort into making this set piece, which makes the area stand out more, especially since a torch has a surprisingly vast amount of usage, so it's not out of the ordinary to have one on you. And that's about it. I mean, he does go over every single boss fight, meticulously rating and criticizing each one, but I don't have much to say about that, though I am gonna comment on how the things he brings up are mostly true. I mean, you have the occasional dumb take here and there, but it ain't so bad. But this video is still just painfully bad, but I'm feeling generous, so you know, we'll put it at a D tier. And we're done, and oh boy, what a spread we've got indeed. Alright, I think you now understand the problem with these videos. They're all just reiterations of what people already said long ago, and arguments that are either nitpicks, lies, or just straight up not enough to deem the game bad, or less than a masterpiece, which I still consider Dark Souls 2 to be. After all, if Dark Souls 1 has problems like this, and yet people grant it such a prestigious title, then this one deserves it too. I was gonna go over more things, like talking about H. Bomber Guy's video, but not only is it very old, but I didn't feel like hearing an argument made by a dude that thinks this segment of N. Orlando is well thought out and designed.
A lot of the first 2 Souls games are based on putting you in a specific place, then throwing a specific thing at you and making you deal with it the way they want you to do.
And frankly, I'm just tired of watching them, especially because of the research I've had to do for this upload alone, since basically all of them are there to answer 2 questions that simply don't exist. And due to them being so mixed, you're essentially locked into one choice, which is doing what Lenny recommends, which is to form your own opinion on it through playing it yourself, and you're definitely not going to be discouraged from playing it, at least not anymore, because if you press 2 buttons, you'd find so many people saying nice things about Dark Souls 2, which will absolutely convince you to get the game if these don't. But Bradley, aren't you perpetuating the same decade-long argument that ultimately gets nowhere because some people will always complain and never listen? Well, not really, since I'm saving your time by telling you not to watch all of these and showing their fundamental flaws in a unique and original way. For Bradley, you're clearly being biased. Just look at yourself. Yes, from my outfit alone, you can definitely tell that Dark Souls 2 is my favorite, and I genuinely believe it to be generally better than Dark Souls 1, but don't say that when I'm acknowledging its flaws. Just because most of these people's arguments aren't good doesn't suddenly make me a toxic stan. I've been playing these games for years, so I know what makes them good, so it adds credibility to my arguments, and really I just want this shit to end. Like, I never even wanted to watch a single one of these and just ignored them as you should, but I needed to for this video, and even today Dark Souls 2 reviews that just regurgitate stuff with little to no new things to offer are still being made. Like, what? And to show that, I won't be making another one of these. But Bradley, isn't your logic flawed because other games have videos reviewing them to this day and you seemingly have no problem with it? The difference is that those exist purely to express their love/hate for a game without answering a non-existent question, and they most definitely have more unique and original things to say than these, while not either just blatantly lying or nitpicking or something else. If you've got any more questions you'd like to know more about, just leave them in the comments. I have less than 1,000 subs, so anything you won't say won't be dismissed by me, and I hope that you learned a thing or two about this video. Also, you know what? Feeble King's video is going straight to the Shadow Realm, actually.